Hello, so I recently made a wooden train table for my kids and I wanted to make a little do-it-yourself video covering the process that I went through. I wish I could take credit for this idea, but there's tons of these all over the internet. So I found that when I tried to make this table, there really wasn't any solid instructions or good how-to videos covering each builder's process, so I figured I'd take a stab at making my own. This is my first DIY video, so I apologize if it's a little rough around the edges, but my train table is too, so that's okay. My 3-year-old son is obsessed with trains. He loves his wooden train Thomas sets. We're always having to get on the floor and play with him, and they're always covering the floor of our playroom. They're probably second in line to Legos if you step on them in the middle of the night. We had a small wooden train table, but it was kind of a piece of junk, and it wasn't cheap, but it was made very cheaply out of particle board. So I knew there had to be a better way for my son and my daughter to play with these wooden trains. While my family and I are using this as a wooden train table, the concept would be pretty much exactly the same if you wanted to use it for Legos or dolls or any other cars, any other kind of small toys. The tools that I use for this build are the following: a measuring tape, a cordless drill, 3/32 drill bit for the pilot holes, a Phillips screw head for the drill, 1.5 inch length screws that were 1/8 inch diameter, and I got a box of 100 of those. 4 sliding clamps, orbital sander, 60, 100, 220, and 400 grit sandpaper, paints to cover the top of the table. The paint scheme and the color scheme is your choice. You'll need a paint roller, and then we use some detailed paint brushes to do the shorelines. I started with a shopping trip to the local Ikea. That's where I picked up the 2 Trofast frames that I used as the base for the table. I purchased them in the pine finish and they ran me about $59 each. Additionally, with the purchase of the Trofast frames, I got 4 each medium-sized orange storage bins that were about $4, 4 each small green-sized storage bins that were $3, 2 each medium-sized black storage bins that were $4, and finally, 2 each small-sized white storage bins that were about $3. All totaled, the IKEA portion of our shopping list cost us $162. And while that is a lot of money, the amount of time my children play on this table and the use they'll get out of it is worth it to us. After the boy and I picked these items up at IKEA, we just headed across the street to the local big box hardware store. We already had most of the parts and tools that we needed, but there were still a few items that we needed to pick up. The shopping list consisted mostly of a 1/2 inch thick piece of plywood that measured 63 by 37 inches, some paints and paint supplies to cover the surface, and we also picked up some molding that we didn't end up installing on the table yet. That'll be done maybe at a later date and time. While I was at the big box hardware store, I took a bit of a shortcut. You can call it cheating if you want, but basically, there's a professional carpenter on staff that was able to custom cut the wood the way I needed it done. I think most of the big box hardware stores have this now, Lowe's and Home Depot. There's a guy who works there who can do all these cuts for you. It shouldn't be too difficult to do this on your own, and if you're willing to tackle this project, then I'm sure you're capable of doing them. I think the most difficult thing would be cutting the 21 inch diameter circle in the center of the table, but like I said, if you're willing to tackle this project, you're probably capable of doing that. Alright, now that we have all of our supplies, it's time to start the build. The very first step I took in this process was assembling both of the Trofast frames. This was the most interactive portion for my kids, and they really had a blast getting involved. They knew what the end goal was, and both my son and daughter were very excited to see it come together. The kids loved helping, and they really loved crawling through the frames as we put them together. After they were fully assembled, the next step was to line up the tabletop on the Trofast frames. Once I was happy with how everything lined up, I clamped it down with the 4 clamps. Once the clamps were securely in place, the next step was to mark where I wanted to put the pilot holes. I placed holes for all the pilot screws at all 4 corners of the table, as well as the 4 corners of each of the Trofast frames. And then I used spacing of about 3.5 inches, continuing along the line of where the Trofast frames were under the table. After all the holes were drilled, it was time to break out the orbital sander and work the tabletop so it was extra smooth. I started with 60 grit sandpaper, and I worked my way down to 400 grit sandpaper for that really silky smooth finish. And then when I was happy with the tabletop surface, I started drilling in all the screws. I made sure not to go too fast while drilling them in because that can split the wood, but you also have to go fast enough to make sure that the screws sink in past the surface of the tabletop so you countersink the screws. After verifying the tabletop was completely secured with all the screws, I removed the clamps and I started painting the table. This process was probably the most time consuming, mostly because you had to wait for the paint to dry in between coats. I used a combination of oil and water-based paints because in all honesty, I really didn't have a clue what I was buying. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but we currently live in Slovakia, so the big box hardware store didn't really have anything with an English label on it. The green paint was the one that was oil-based, and it took almost all night to dry, and I was actually really nervous that it wouldn't be completely dry by the time the kids woke up. Thankfully, with the help of some fans and some heat guns, I was able to get it to dry, but that was really my biggest source of anxiety because I didn't want the kids to wake up and see it, but then have to be told that they couldn't touch it because the paint had to dry.
Oh, Daddy, you made the frame table.
I think it came out really well, and even though it's not still 100% finished, I still want to add some molding to the edges of the table. The kids were ecstatic, and all of the flaws in it are transparent to them. They don't see or notice any of that stuff. So, in conclusion, both kids are extremely happy with the table. I see them getting hours and hours of use out of it for years to come. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate your time, and I hope you got something from this, and I hope you enjoy making your train table. Thanks.